Man finds a cooler floating down the river and actually opens it. He sighed in relief as he pulled the container along the bank of the river. At least he knew it couldn't be something sinister. He dropped the container down on the shore and a nervous crowd gathered. He opened the cooler, but what he saw would be burned in his mind forever. The bank was a spot that the locals loved to hang out at. The river was loved by many until the strange cooler appeared out of nowhere. When he saw the strange container floating in the river, he knew he had to figure out what it was, but he could never have anticipated what the contents inside were going to be. It felt almost like he was in a movie. The container bobbed down the river. The man decided to record the cooler before taking in any other action. Then he went down to get a better look. He finally figured out that it was, in fact, a cooler box. Maybe someone picnicking dropped it accidentally. He was always a curious individual, and sometimes it got the better of him. Today was no exception. He had to open the box. He decided to ask around the area if anyone had lost a cooler box, but they simply shook their head. No one had even noticed that there was one floating in the river. He walked up to two men that were hanging out by the shore and asked them if they knew anything about it. The men shook their heads, but now seemed invested in it as much as he was. The man behind the camera speculated that it might have treasure inside. Then the other men also theorized what might be inside, but there was another question: who would go fetch it? The cameraman was shooting the footage so he couldn't jump in and get it. They decided that the guy in the blue shorts would be the man to do it. As the man in blue swimming shorts got ready to wade in the river, the cameraman skipped a flat stone across the water to judge the distance. He assured the unwitting man that there was no need to hurry, saying, "I don't think it's moving for a while." The man in blue finally began to wade until he was hip deep. Then he started to paddle. His dog followed him too, and he reached the water cooler in no time. Then anticipation began to grow. The cameraman saw that the man had made it to the cooler and yelled, "Float it over!" Everybody on the shore waited excitedly for the man to reach the riverbank as he pushed the container to the other side of the river. "It's like Christmas," someone shouted. The man wasn't having too much trouble pushing the cooler, so the onlooker reasoned that it couldn't be too heavy. When he finally made it back to the shore and pushed the cooler up the bank, people started to notice something odd. On closer inspection, the cooler had been sealed with duct tape. This meant that someone had known that it would end up in the river. The cameraman, recognizing the brand, asked, "Has it got one of those hatches?" Then he walked over and waited for the man in blue to carefully peel the tape off the cooler, but neither of the men could ever have expected what they were about to find. After the duct tape was removed, the man lifted the hatch and took a peek inside, but leapt back with a curse, exclaiming, "What the?" Then he looked right into the camera with his eyes wide in disbelief and fear. But what could have been inside the cooler that had frightened him so much? The cameraman pushed the man aside and looked in the cooler for himself. When he saw what lay within, he reeled. His brain couldn't process what he saw, and he too leaped back and cursed. He had seen tiny limbs inside, but something told him that this couldn't be right. Approaching the cooler again, he looked inside for the second time. Then he threw his head back and began laughing maniacally. There, inside the cooler, was an eerie sight. The two men still couldn't believe their eyes. It was a baby doll. The men stood still, laughing nervously. Then a few onlookers approached the cooler, and they all had a similar reaction of blind fear, followed by apprehension. "There's a body in there," one man joked, but there was no humor in it, because with the doll as a sinister message written inside the cooler. The cameraman whispered, "I'm like shaking." But not all of the men were so spooked. They couldn't wrap their heads around why someone would hide a doll in a cooler in the first place. "Wait, maybe there's cocaine in there," one ventured. Then the man examined the doll closely, but there was nothing inside. The men continued to search but found no clues, until they noticed something scrawled down the inside of the box. Then one of the onlookers approached, wondering what all the commotion was about. The cameraman quickly snapped the hatch shut and told her to look for herself. He was hoping to startle her as they all had been, and it worked. The woman jumped back and cursed too. After her fright, she exclaimed, "Who does that?" Only a truly disturbed person would come up with a stunt like this. "I guess somebody gets a free cooler out of it," the cameraman quipped. "Dibs on the doll." Then more people gathered around to see the mysterious cooler and its unsettling contents for themselves. Mr. Technical Difficult, a popular YouTube channel, later uploaded the video. It soon went viral, garnering millions of views and thousands of comments. The commenters expressed disbelief and amusement, but some were terrified. One user commented, "Put that thing back where it came from, or so help me." He was one of the many viewers who believed that the doll was part of something much more sinister. Some believed that it should be left alone, while others suggested that it was a prank that had been set up by the cameraman himself, saying he just put a doll in a cooler, then taped it, and then finally he put it in a river and started recording. What do you believe? One woman's chilling story started when she revisited her childhood home and finally discovered what was in the basement. Recently, one homeowner made a remarkable find. Hidden doors have always sparked an interest in most people. The thrill of finding a forgotten space makes people shudder with anticipation. Often, in an older home, people will flirt with the possibility, but you never really bargain on it becoming a reality. But for one woman, it did, and what she found behind the hidden door made her totally lose it. Alexandra Poulos had nothing but fond memories of her childhood home. Her parents had originally bought the colonial property in 1974. You can only imagine how many memories the space picked up over the years. However, amidst the fond reminiscences, there was a subtle undertone of eeriness. As a child, Alexandra would have recurring dreams of hidden rooms and passages. If only she knew how true those actually were, and what power she'd eventually find. As a child, Alexandra had a vivid imagination. As such, when she spoke out about her dreams, people brushed them off. Everyone assumed it was her mind creating a mystery for her to enjoy. However, the dreams continued, but when she researched the meaning of such dreams, she was left disappointed. However, upon closer inspection as an adult, Alexandra was dazed by the cleverness of her childhood reveries. Then Poulos learned the unfortunate news. Alexandra's mother had become ill. She was an elderly lady, hence such news wasn't particularly uncommon, so the family blew the news off. She was a tough old lady, so the family had every faith that she would recover. However, little did they realize how poor a decision that was. Her condition grew progressively worse. They began to fear the worst, until one day the unexpected struck. In short succession, two harrowing occurrences took place. Within the space of a few short months, Alexandra lost both her mom and brother. This left the family in disarray, particularly since they were so closely knit as a unit. As she attempted to make sense of the tragedy, Alexandra grew more despairing, but she had such precious keepsake memories in the house that she drew faith from its four walls. She had no idea what the home was hiding. Thankfully, Alexandra still had her dad. A death can distress any family, let alone two members passing in such quick succession. However, remarkably, Alexandra and her father made it through. The pair relied on the loved one of another. But a problem was arising. Alexandra's dad was old, and the colonial home was large. He was quickly learning how unmanageable it was for one person. He then broke the news to his daughter. One afternoon, Alexandra's dad called her over. He explained how he was beginning to struggle in the home. As an elderly person, there was just too much for him to keep up with. Due to the sheer size of the house, he was unable to maintain all of it. As such, he planned on selling the home. All of a sudden, Alexandra's precious childhood home was in peril, and with it, a hidden magic. Even though Alexandra wasn't ready for her dad's news, she quickly came up with a counter. She suggested he sign over the home to her. Surprisingly, her father readily agreed. With that, the home was guaranteed to stay in the family. Alexandra was thrilled. She then decided to let the home out. She found lovely new tenants in no time, but it wasn't long until mysterious things began to happen in the basement. Shortly after her new tenants moved in, problems began to occur in the basement. It was as though the house was being hostile towards the new family. Slowly, an old warning began to come back to Alexandra. She remembered a conversation her father had with a neighbor. The old man had warned her father that their home was hiding something depraved. Alexandra began to question whether an otherworldly power had influence over her home, until she started looking. Alexandra remembered the man's warning that their basement had a basement of its own. Her father had waved off the warning as wild ramblings of an old man. However, with all of the odd occurrences taking place in the basement, Alexandra began to question the validity of the statement. So, she decided to look for herself. Professional builders were hired to excavate the basement area, and when they did, they were left aghast. When the builders began to excavate, it didn't take long for them to discover something odd. They quickly unearthed what Alexandra had suspected. Her basement had a basement of its own. But when she entered, Alexandra was left stupefied. The simple room had little to it, but it wasn't the simplicity of the room that was baffling. Rather, its purpose. Alexandra had to understand why it was there. So, she sought professional help once more. When she approached a local historian, Alexandra learned of a dark history of her town. It had been home to a movement known as the abolitionists. These people dedicated their lives to abolishing slavery in Northern America. As such, they created the historical Underground Railroad. This was a system of tunnels developed to help people escape through Lansdowne. However, the historian needed to take a closer look. But upon further inspection, the findings were baffling. Upon further inspection, the historian could reach no substantial conclusion. Due to the nature of the room, it could have been a simple storage room. But why then was it sealed shut? All the historian could proffer was to delve deeper into the history of the home. But Alexandra knew in her heart what the room was for, and when a neighbor revealed a similar scenario in their home, her beliefs grew stronger than ever. A neighbor of Alexandra had revealed something interesting. They too had found a hidden room in their home. They were made aware that it was, in fact, a part of the Underground Railroad. Upon hearing this, Alexandra knew this was the purpose of her hidden room. Although she had no conclusive evidence, her feeling was strong. She shared the story on social media. From this she learned more about the hidden Underground Railroad past of her hometown. Even though decades have passed, little pieces of the abolitionists keep popping up. The Underground Railroad was a brilliant system. This helped Americans overcome a grisly situation. With precious findings like the one Alexandra made, awareness can be shed on what once was an enigmatic subject. "I need to figure out next steps," Alexandra said. But it seems she is keen to pursue the room's purpose further.